To welcome you to the fall season. At 2:50 a.m. yesterday morning, Saturday morning, the autumn equinox arrived. It occurred. Summer is officially over. Fall has officially come. I was asleep at the time and didn't notice any seismic change of what was going on, and I imagine most of you were asleep as well, but I did read about this later when I got up in the morning and was up and about. Of course, we've noticed all the signs around us. The sun is setting earlier, the days are a little cooler, like this morning. The leaves are turning to their fall colors. And with a little bit of help from my wife, who identifies flowers much more ably than I do, I've noticed all these blooming plants along the side of the road and in the fields. And she pointed out that those are fall asters blooming and dotting the roadsides and the fields we are passing by. What I do know, though, is that fall asters are sometimes referred to as Michaelmas daisies. And they are so named because they come into bloom this time of year around the time of the feast day of Saint Michael and All Angels, which takes place this Friday, September 29th. Now, as many of you know, I recently served at St. Michael's Church in Marblehead, Massachusetts, till a little bit more than a year ago. And each year, St. Michael's celebrated its namesake, St. Michael the Archangel, by transferring the feast day from the 29th to the last Sunday of September. So today, St. Michael's Marblehead, and I'm sure many other St. Michael's churches, are all celebrating Michaelmas. Michaelmas, as you can put that together, is Michael Mass, a Mass for Michael, so Michaelmas. And I can tell you this last week, even though I wasn't involved in this, the head of the Altar Guild down at St. Michael's in Marblehead was scouring Marblehead for Michaelmas daisies in order to adorn the altar, as the Altar Guild did every year. And there was always a minor panic if the plants, the asters, the Michaelmas daisies were late blooming. But somehow they always appeared in time and always on the altar. Now, I did read in the St. Michael's newsletter that today they are having an all-parish potluck lunch after today's service. And in all the years I was there, I don't think we ever did that. And I thought to myself, boy, what a good idea. Geez, I wish I had thought of that. And I have to admit that I have nothing to do with it, but I was feeling a little resentful and a little envious that, frankly, they're moving on without me. And, but they have good reason to celebrate, though. And I shared with Kate Mulrennan this last week, head of St. Francis Discernment Committee, and I shared with the vestry that St. Michael's has just called their new rector, actually a new priest in charge, who's going to start this coming November. They began their search probably about 6 months prior to St. Francis beginning your search here. And so they're a little further along in the process. But here, they've interviewed people and they've called somebody, and they're very happy he is going to start in November. Well, here again, I felt a little bit of sadness, or maybe just a tad resentment that they've done so. Now, I could not be more happy for them. And again, I have nothing to do with this, and I have to admit I'm being a bit melodramatic about it, but they're moving on. They're moving on. I did retire after all, and I can assure you I am so glad to be in Maine, and I'm very glad to be here at St. Francis. But I mention this because these feelings, and maybe you've had similar things, are not too far beneath the surface, and they tend to bubble up, some type of resentment or envy or frustration or a host of other things that can just pop up when we least expect it. So it can be a challenge to let go of them, to let go and let God, as we hear that expression so often. So hard to see the joys that are about us when we get wrapped up in whatever frustration or envy that we are holding on to. Last week we spoke about forgiveness and how that is part and parcel of our spiritual practice. And we talked about how it takes perseverance and effort, takes some mindfulness and some work on our part, like any spiritual discipline does. And we are asked to bear in our hearts and minds that we ourselves are forgiven out of the abundance and generosity of God's love and mercy. And as that generosity exists for us, well, it exists for others as well. Even those we might think are not that deserving of it. And that's part of the challenge, too. So here in our gospel lesson this morning, Jesus offers a parable about the kingdom of heaven. And in it, we find a dramatic example of this generosity. We find in it a generosity of grace and love and mercy that, frankly, at times can pull us up a little short. The elements in the story and the setting are quite normal. The grapes are ready for harvest, and the landlord needs workers to bring that in. There are day laborers at the marketplace that are unemployed and ready to work. The landlord goes in the morning, probably about 6 o'clock in the morning, and hires a few, and agreeing to the normal standard day's wage, which was about a denarius. And throughout the day, the landlord sees more work is needed. And so he goes and hires more at 9 o'clock, at noon, at 3, and then finally at 5 o'clock. And maybe like those first workers, we assume that those at the end of the day might not get paid the same as at the beginning. Note that he doesn't mention pay at all, but hires all just the same. And as we know, as you heard in the story, at the end of the day, each receives a full day's wages. And, joining with those first workers, it seems a bit unfair. And the parable ends with those famous words, "The last will be first, and the first will be last." So this seems to be about a story about a reversal of fortune, and yet no one has lost anything. And perhaps the heart of this parable comes in the answer to the question about wages from those early morning workers, saying, well, we've toiled in the labor and the sun, and we've done all this work. They didn't do that much work, so how can you pay them the same? And the landlord says, are you envious because I am generous? A literal translation of this verse is your eye evil because I am good? So we can see that these first workers have just let that frustration creep in and have blinded them to, well, the pay and what they've received in return, the generosity of the landlord. As the scholar Fred Craddock points out, and others mention this too, the offense of grace is not in the treatment we receive, but in the observation that others are getting more than they deserve, or at least more than we think that they should deserve. Now, I imagine each of us has felt that sting of unfairness at some time, whether as children with our brothers and sisters, or through our parents, or as adults with co-workers or those who we engage in activities with. We've worked hard, we've done the right thing, while our brother or sister or coworker receives recognition and kudos, and maybe even the same pay that we got. It might be something as simple as the cashier line next to us or on either side of us going twice as fast as the one we're in, which is what happened to me last Tuesday. It was not a good experience. But I was able to pay my goods. I got out, and frankly, it took maybe a minute longer. Or maybe frustrating like the car that's cutting in front of you when everyone else is just doing it normally, but they shot up the side. Again, it's hard to let go and let God. Of course, these are small annoyances, but such things fester. In the Gospels, we can think of the story of Martha and Mary, for example. Martha, who is taking care of everything and everybody, while Mary sits in quiet contemplation. Jesus tells Martha that Mary has done the better thing. Or the story of the prodigal son. If you remember, the younger son takes his inheritance, goes off to a foreign land and squanders it all. He returns home where his father welcomes him and holds a feast for his return. Meanwhile, the older son has dutifully managed the property, the assets, and his life right next to his father. He seems to have done the right thing, and yet the brother is honored. Where is the justice in this? That older brother says. That's what we might say too. As another scholar, Herbert O'Driscoll, says, there is naturally resentment and envy. But the teaching of Jesus is clear. The categories of the kingdom go beyond the categories of the world. The generosity of God goes beyond what we can imagine, beyond even our understanding of justice. And that is fortunate for us and for all. The stories of the Bible are that God is about justice, and God is about mercy. God's grace reigns on the just and the unjust, the grateful and the ungrateful. And in the end, again, this is good news for all of us. There is a poem by R.S. Thomas called The Kingdom, and I'd like to share that with you right now. And I think this helps capture this somewhat. The poem goes like this. It is a long way off, but inside it there are quite different things going on. Festivals at which the poor man is king and the consumptive is healed. Mirrors in which the blind look at themselves and love looks at them back. And industry is for mending the bent bones and minds fractured by life. It is a long way off, but to get there takes no time, and admission is free if you will purge yourself of desire, and present yourself with your need only and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. God does not give up on us, nor those who have squandered what has been given them. While we live in this world, and our wages are important, as is our work, we are asked to be mindful of the greater aspect of our being. This is the generosity of God's unfailing love and grace. And this is a hope that is always before us. The kingdom is always before us. It's always within us. It's always breaking in around us. And it is dynamic, always bubbling up when we might least expect it. So as searchers and seekers of it, we are asked to orient ourselves to the generosity that is around us, to be on guard of the forces of our nature that draw us away, and ask God to open our eyes to the joys prepared for us. In Christ's name, amen.